I'd been on the force 2 years when I learned that some people run because they're guilty, and some run because stopping is worse than whatever's chasing them. I didn't know which one Ruby Calloway was yet. I only knew the tip was good, the van was in position, and my hands didn't shake the way they used to before a takedown. The informant called her a courier for the Vantine Concern. Said she'd be at the harbor warehouses past midnight, alone, moving product through a gap in the dock patrol schedule. We'd been building the file for 3 weeks. Surveillance photos. A plate number that led to a stolen registration. A woman, mid-20s, dark hair, moved like she expected to be watched. We'd run the surveillance in shifts, 2 officers at a time, parked 4 blocks out in an unmarked sedan with a long lens propped on a rolled-down window. I'd taken most of the night shifts myself, telling my captain it was easier on my schedule, which was true enough not to be a lie. I watched her pattern emerge over those weeks, the way you learn a person from a distance before you ever speak to them. The routes she varied, never the same one twice in a row. The way she always parked facing the exit, never nose in. The small, habitual check of her mirrors before she so much as touched a door handle. Whoever had trained her, or whatever life had trained her, had made her careful in a way most people in this line of work weren't. I sat in the back of the van with Reyes and Salman, watching the monitor feed from the camera we'd mounted on the light pole outside the 3rd warehouse, the one with the cracked sodium lamp that left a dead zone of shadow along the loading dock. My captain wanted this one. Said if we could flip a courier, we could climb the ladder toward whoever ran the syndicate's harbor operations. I wanted to believe that's all it was to me too, that climbing the ladder was the whole of my interest in a woman I'd never met. She showed up at 12:40, driving a gray sedan with her headlights off until the last turn. Even on grainy black and white footage, there was something deliberate in the way she checked her mirrors, like she'd practiced not looking nervous so many times the practice itself had turned into a kind of nervousness all its own. She idled at the mouth of the lot for almost a full minute before committing to the turn, scanning the rooftops, the parked cars, the dark stretch between 2 warehouses where a person could be standing without being seen. I found myself holding my breath in sympathy with her caution, which struck me even then as a strange thing to feel about someone I was about to arrest. "That's our girl," Reyes said, not looking up from the secondary monitor. I keyed the radio. Patrol cars moved into position 3 blocks out, lights off, engines idling, the kind of careful silence that takes a department years to train into people. We let her park. Let her open the trunk. The second her hands touched the duffel bag, I gave the signal. She ran. I hadn't expected that. Couriers usually freeze or they talk fast, hoping a deal might save them before the cuffs are even on. She didn't do either. She left the bag in the open trunk and sprinted for the chain-link fence at the edge of the lot, scaled it in a single motion like she'd done it 100 times in the dark with worse things behind her than 3 officers and a warrant, and dropped onto the access road on the other side without breaking stride. I was already moving. Salman swore behind me, radioing patrol to redirect, and I shoved through the van's side door and hit the ground running before I'd fully processed the decision to chase her myself instead of waiting for backup to box her in. I climbed the fence after her, landed hard enough to feel it in both knees and kept going. The dock lights threw long shadows across the concrete, and she used every one of them, cutting between shipping containers stacked 3 high, doubling back once through a gap I almost missed to throw me off her trail before I caught the rhythm of her footsteps against the wet concrete and didn't lose her again. He was fast. Faster than anyone I'd chased before. The kind of fast that doesn't come from training but from a body that's had to outrun worse than a chain-link fence more than once. But the docks ended in water on 3 sides and she knew it the same second I did. I saw her shoulders drop half an inch when she hit the final stretch of open concrete between 2 empty berths and realized there was nowhere left to go that didn't end in the bay. She turned to face me instead of running, and that was the first time I saw her properly. Not through a camera lens or a file photo but close enough to see her chest heaving under a dark jacket, her jaw set somewhere between defiance and fear, her eyes doing the math on whether she could still get past me, around me, into the water if it came to that. "Hands where I can see them," I said, weapon level, breath ragged from the run, the radio at my shoulder already crackling with Salman's voice calling our position. She didn't move for a second. Then she laughed, short and bitter, the sound of it carrying oddly across the open dock, like the situation was funny in a way only she understood and had understood for a long time before tonight. "You don't know what you're doing," she said. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Hands." She raised them slowly, and I saw the tremor in her fingers that her voice hadn't given away, the only crack in a composure that had otherwise held through a sprint and a dead end and a gun pointed at her chest. I cuffed her there on the dock, concrete cold under both our knees, the metal biting into her wrists in a way I tried, almost without deciding to keep from being any tighter than it had to be. Gulls circled overhead in the dark, already restless, like they smelled the night ending before either of us did. In the patrol car, she sat in the back seat with her head against the window, watching the warehouses slide past, saying nothing for the entire ride. I watched her in the rearview more than I watched the road, which I knew even then was a poor habit for someone driving a suspect to booking. She had a scar along her jaw I hadn't noticed in the surveillance photos, thin and old, the kind that comes from something other than an accident. A way of holding herself, even cuffed, even caught, like she was bracing for a blow that never quite landed but never quite stopped coming either. Shoulders drawn slightly in, chin angled to protect the side of her face that had already been marked once. "You've got a name?" I asked, mostly to fill the silence, though I told myself it was procedure. She met my eyes in the mirror, steady, unblinking. "You'll read it in the file. I'd rather hear it from you. Why does that matter to you?" I didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. I drove the rest of the way without trying for one. She gave it up eventually at the station, flat and unwilling, like the name itself cost her something to say out loud to people who'd write it down and use it against her. Ruby Calloway. 26. No fixed address on record, though we both knew that wasn't true, just that she'd been careful enough or scared enough to keep it off paper for longer than most people manage. The duffel bag held enough product to put her away for a long time, and everyone in that building knew it the moment the lab results came back from the night's haul, weighed and bagged and logged under a case number that would follow her for the rest of whatever life the courts decided to leave her. I should have closed the file there. Booked her, written the report, let the system do what it was built to do, gone home, slept, shown up the next day for whatever came next in a career that had, until that night, made a kind of uncomplicated sense to me. Instead, I found myself in the records room an hour past my shift's end, reading her intake form twice, looking at the line where it asked for next of kin and finding it left blank. Not unanswered, not unknown, but blank, like a decision rather than an omission, and wondering what kind of life leaves that line empty by choice instead of circumstance. I thought about all the forms I'd filled out in my own life, school registrations, job applications, the academy's intake paperwork, and how automatically my father's name had gone into that space every single time, like it had never occurred to me that the line could be a question instead of a formality. I didn't know yet that I was already asking the wrong question. Not what she'd done. What had been done to her first. The Vantine Concern wasn't a name forensics found written anywhere convenient. We pieced it together over days. A shell company here, a dock lease there, a pattern of disappearances that never connected on paper but connected in every other way that mattered. Ruby wouldn't confirm it outright. He didn't have to. The way her face went still every time the name came up in interrogation told us enough. My captain assigned me to the follow-up interviews, partly because I'd made the arrest, partly because nobody else wanted to spend hours in a room with someone who answered every question with another question. The first session lasted 40 minutes and produced exactly nothing usable. No names beyond the ones we already had, no routes, no admission that would help build the case any higher up the chain. She sat across the table with her hands folded, cuffed loosely to a ring bolted into the surface, and watched me the way you'd watch a storm you weren't sure was going to pass over or hit directly. "Tell me about the Vantine Concern," I said the first time, sliding a photo of one of the shell company's registered addresses across the table. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took to register what it was, then looked back at me without a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Never heard of it. You were carrying their product." I was carrying a bag. I didn't ask who packed it. It went like that for the better part of an hour. I tried different angles. The financial records, the route patterns, the names of 2 men we suspected ran logistics for the syndicate's harbor operations. And she met every one of them with the same flat, practiced nothing, the kind of stonewalling that takes either real ignorance or real discipline, and I was fairly certain by the end of that first session it wasn't ignorance. "Why do you care who I worked for?" she asked the 3rd time I sat across from her. 3 sessions and 3 days deep into a case file that was filling up faster with my own observations than with anything resembling evidence. "Because whoever it is, they're bigger than you. And you're the one sitting here. That's how it's supposed to work. Doesn't mean it's fair." She studied me like I'd said something in a language she didn't expect me to know. "Fair," she repeated, testing the word. "Where I come from, that's not a real thing. It's just a word people use when they're winning." I didn't push that day. I came back the next and the one after, building a file that was less about the syndicate and more about her, though I told myself otherwise every time I signed out the interview room. The desk sergeant started teasing me about it after the 4th visit, asking if I was angling for a promotion or just liked the coffee in that particular room, and I laughed it off without a good answer either way. Bit by bit she let things slip. Not confessions, she was too careful for that, but fragments, dropped almost carelessly into the silences between my questions, like she'd decided the silences were safer to fill than the questions themselves. A reference to a foster placement that hadn't worked out, mentioned once and never again no matter how I circled back to it. A flinch when another officer raised his voice down the hall. Gone so fast I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of thing. The kind of full-body flinch that doesn't come from a single bad day. The scar on her jaw when I finally asked, got a one-word answer. Childhood. Delivered in a tone that closed the door on follow-up before I could ask anything else, flat and final, saying more than a longer answer would have. He had a rhythm. Open a little, then slam it shut, watch to see if I'd push, and when I didn't, open a little further the next time. I started to understand it as a kind of testing, deliberate or not. Like she'd been burned enough times by people who used her openness against her that trust had to be earned in increments too small for most people to bother measuring, let alone respect. I bothered. "You're not what I expected," I told her the 5th or 6th visit, when the file on my desk had grown thick with information that wasn't evidence of anything except who she was. Small details that would never make it into a courtroom, that existed only because I'd started writing them down for reasons I hadn't examined too closely. "What did you expect? Someone who didn't care?" "I don't. You care enough to make sure I know you don't. That's not nothing." She considered me, quiet, and something in her face cracked just slightly. Not a smile, nothing that generous, but a loosening around the eyes, like she'd decided I wasn't worth the full weight of her guard for just this one exchange. "You're persistent," she said. "It's annoying. I've been told." "By who?" "Everyone who's ever worked with me." That got the closest thing to a laugh I'd heard from her, quick and surprised, like it had escaped before she could stop it. A sound that seemed to catch her as off guard as it caught me. She covered it almost immediately, schooling her face back into something neutral, but I'd heard it, and I held on to that sound longer than I should have, turning it over on the drive home, wondering why a stranger's laugh had any business taking up that much space in my head when I had a dozen other open cases that deserved the room instead. My father called that night the way he did most Sundays, asking how the job was treating me. I told him about the arrest, the syndicate angle, the slow work of an interrogation that wasn't going anywhere fast on paper even if it was going somewhere I hadn't named yet. He listened the way he always had, patient, steady, the same man who'd taught me to drive and to shoot and to believe that the badge meant something only if the person wearing it did too. "Sounds like she's got you thinking," he said in the easy, observant way he had of noticing things in my voice before I noticed them myself. "She's a case, Dad." I didn't say she wasn't. I didn't have a response to that. I went to bed turning his words over instead of hers and didn't sleep well, and blamed it on the case file when I knew that wasn't the whole truth, not even close. I requested the transport assignment on a Tuesday, framing it the only way that would survive my captain's scrutiny, Ruby still had information on syndicate operations, informant networks, supply routes. Keeping continuity on her case meant keeping me in the room when she finally decided to talk. My captain signed off without much thought. Why would he? It was good police work on paper, the kind of careful continuity that looks responsible in a file and raises no flags in a review. It got me 20 minutes alone with her every transport between Holding and the courthouse. Longer if traffic cooperated. I started timing routes that wouldn't, learning which intersections ran slow at which hours, which bridge had construction that would add 10 minutes without looking deliberate, building a private map of delay laid over the city's actual geography. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything the way people who've had to survive on noticing things always do. "You're taking the long way," she said the second week, watching the river slide past the window instead of looking at me, her cuffed hands resting still in her lap. "Traffic. There's no traffic at 6 in the morning." I didn't answer and she let it go, which felt like an answer on its own. Not agreement, just a decision not to push on something she'd already understood without needing it spelled out. The drives became their own kind of ritual. I'd pick her up from Holding, the duty officer logging the transport with the particular boredom of routine paperwork, and we'd take the river route past the warehouses she'd run through that first night, past the dock where I'd cuffed her, both of us aware of the geography even when neither of us mentioned it. She started talking in pieces during those drives, not stories exactly, more like weather reports on a life she'd otherwise have kept entirely sealed. It was on one of those drives, the fourth week, that she told me about the nightmares. Unprompted, which surprised me more than the content did. She wasn't someone who offered things unprompted, not after weeks of watching her ration every word like it cost her something to spend it. "I dream about doors," she said, watching the water slide by gray and flat under an early sky. "Doors that won't lock. I check them and they still won't lock, and I know something's behind me and I can't make myself turn around to see what." "Have you talked to anyone about that?" "I'm talking to you. I mean someone whose job it is." My job was never the kind that came with someone whose job it was to listen. She said it without bitterness, just fact, the way you'd report a weather pattern, flat and matter of fact, the words landing harder than if she'd said it with any anger at all. "You're the closest thing I've had." I kept my eyes on the road because I didn't trust what my face might do if she saw it, and the river kept sliding by, and the silence in the car had a weight to it that hadn't been there on any of the other drives. "The doors," I said finally. "Do you know what's behind you?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer, long enough that I almost told her she didn't have to. Then, my father used to come into my room at night. I was 9 when it started. Flat. Practiced flat, like she'd said it to herself so many times the saying had worn the feeling smooth, the way river stones go smooth from years of the same current passing over them. I used to lie there and listen for the door because if I heard it open I had maybe 4 seconds before he was at the bed. 4 seconds isn't enough to do anything. It's just enough to know it's happening. I pulled the car to the shoulder. I don't remember deciding to. My hands did it without consulting the rest of me, gravel crunching under the tires, the engine idling rough in the cold morning air. "Ruby. Don't." Sharp, immediate, her voice cutting through whatever I'd been about to say before I'd even fully formed it. "Don't do the thing where your voice goes soft and sorry. I've had that voice used on me by people who didn't mean it. I'd rather you just drive." So I drove. But I reached over once, slow enough that she'd have time to pull away if she wanted to, and put my hand briefly on top of hers where it sat cuffed in her lap. She didn't pull away. Her fingers shifted, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge the contact without making more of it than either of us could afford yet. And neither of us said anything else for the rest of the route, the river and the gray morning light filling the silence where words would have been too much. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the syndicate files spread out across every available surface, papers anchored against the draft from a window I'd never gotten around to fixing the latch on, and somewhere in the cross-referenced financial records I'd pulled to build the Vantine Concern structure, I found a name that didn't belong there. A retired detective's badge number attached to a closed internal affairs inquiry from 11 years back. Attached to a case that had been quietly buried under the kind of bureaucratic silence that only happens when someone with authority wants a thing to stay buried. My father's badge number. I sat with that for a long time before I let myself understand what I was looking at, the kitchen growing cold around me, the file's pages blurring slightly in the lamplight until I forced myself to read the same line 3 more times, hoping each time that it would resolve into something other than what it plainly said. The case file was 11 years old, and it took me 3 days of careful, after-hours digging to understand what I was looking at because nobody had wanted it understood the first time around. An internal affairs inquiry opened and closed within 6 weeks, into a unit accused of taking payoffs to look the other way on a trafficking route through the Harbor District. My father's name wasn't on the list of accused. It was on the list of officers who'd signed off on the inquiry's conclusion. No wrongdoing found. 3 words, typed flat across the bottom of a page that should have held 100 more. I knew the Harbor District. I'd grown up 2 miles from it, learned to drive on its access roads, eaten fish dinners at restaurants that backed onto the same docks where I'd later chase a woman over a chain-link fence. I knew now who'd controlled the routes through it back then because the corporate shells I'd been tracing for the Vantine Concern's current operations led straight back to the same holding company that had funded the unit under investigation 11 years ago. Different names on the paperwork, same money underneath, the kind of pattern that doesn't show up unless you're already looking for it and know exactly what shape it takes. My father hadn't taken a payoff. I believed that, still do, have turned the question over enough times in the years since to trust that conclusion even now. But he'd signed a report that buried something rotten either because he'd been told to by someone further up the chain than him, or because looking hard enough would have cost him a career he loved and a family he was building, or because the version of justice he'd taught me, steady, solid, unshakable, apparently had room in it for looking away when looking away was easier and nobody with any power was going to ask twice. I sat with all 3 possibilities for longer than I want to admit, turning them over like stones, looking for the one that would let me keep the version of him I'd grown up believing in. I didn't tell Ruby. Not yet. I didn't know how to hold both things at once. My father's hands on the steering wheel, teaching me to merge onto a highway with more patience than I deserved at 16, and my father's signature on a page that let men like the ones who'd built the Vantine Concern keep operating 11 years longer than they should have. 11 years that included every year of Ruby's life on the street, every year she'd spent inside an organization that should have been dismantled before she ever needed a way out of one and instead found a different cage with a syndicate's name on it. I went to see her anyway, off the books this time, no transport assignment to justify it, just a visitor's slip and a captain who didn't ask questions because I'd never given him reason to before, the kind of trust that comes from 2 years of being exactly as reliable as the job required and nothing more until now. "You look different," she said the moment I sat down, before I'd even settled fully into the chair, before I'd said a word. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you look different." I told her. Not everything. Not the part where the realization was reshaping something fundamental in how I understood my own life, the ground I'd stood on without questioning it for 24 years. But the bones of it. The buried inquiry. The holding company. The unit that had looked away so the routes could keep running year after year, while the city told itself the system was working. She listened without interrupting. A small gift from someone who rationed words so carefully, her eyes steady on me the whole time like she was tracking something in my face I wasn't aware of showing. "Welcome to the part where you find out the people protecting you were never as clean as you needed them to be," she said when I finished. Not cruel. Just tired, like she'd made the same discovery so many times across so many different people that it had stopped surprising her, had become just another fact of the landscape she'd learned to navigate. My whole life I thought the system worked. Slow sometimes. Imperfect. But working. It works for the people it's built to work for. The rest of us just live in the gaps. She said it simply, without performance, The way someone states a fact they've never had the luxury of being wrong about. Is that what happened to you? You lived in a gap. She held my gaze, weighing something, deciding how much of the answer I'd actually earned. I lived in worse than a gap. I lived in a house with a man who was supposed to protect me and didn't, and then I lived on streets with people who were supposed to arrest men like him and didn't, and then I lived inside an organization that was supposed to give me a way out and instead gave me a different kind of cage with better pay. She paused, jaw tight, eyes somewhere past me on the wall. You want to know the worst part? Tell me. The worst part is I'm not even special. There's 100 girls with my exact story walking around this city right now, and the system either doesn't see them or doesn't care to. I used to think that made my story matter less. Lately I think it makes it matter more because it means it's not really my story at all. It's the same story over and over, wearing a different face each time. I reached for her hand again, the way I had in the car, slow, deliberate, and this time she turned hers over so our palms met properly, fingers threading without either of us commenting on it, the gesture more natural now than it had any right to be after only a handful of weeks. I want to fix it, I said. I don't know how yet. But I want to. You can't fix it from inside a system that benefits from it staying broken. Then maybe I stop being inside it. She went very still, her hand tightening slightly around mine. Don't say things like that to make me feel better. I'm not. Maddie. My name in her mouth for the first time, careful, like she was testing whether it would hold weight, whether saying it out loud made the moment more real than either of us was ready for. Don't say things like that unless you mean to follow through. People like me don't get the option to take promises back. We learn early that words cost nothing unless someone's willing to pay for them. I had nothing ready to say to that, so I held her hand instead, and let the silence say what I wasn't sure I was ready to say out loud yet. The guard's footsteps echoing somewhere down the hall, the clock on the wall ticking through a visiting hour that felt smaller than the conversation we'd just had inside it. Her sentencing date got set for 6 weeks out, and the weight of that number sat on my chest from the moment the judge announced it in a courtroom too small for the size of what was being decided in it. The Vantine Concern's trafficking and assassination charges meant the prosecution wanted the maximum the law allowed. Life, most likely, given what the file already showed and what informants were still adding to it week by week. Each new detail another nail in a door that was closing on her future before she'd turned 27. Ruby had stopped pretending the math didn't apply to her. I've made peace with it, she told me on one of our transport routes, voice level in a way that frightened me more than if she'd cried, more than if she'd raged against the unfairness of it the way I half expected, half wanted her to. You shouldn't have to make peace with a life sentence at 26. Shouldn't isn't a word that's ever applied to my life, Maddie. I learned that a long time ago. You learn to stop expecting fairness once you've watched it fail to show up enough times in a row. I started visiting more, transport assignment or not, using every favor I'd built up with the desk sergeant to get time in the room, signing out slips under reasons that grew thinner with each visit until I stopped bothering to make them sound convincing at all. She kept talking in pieces, filling in the parts of her history I hadn't asked for directly but that she seemed to need to say out loud before whatever came next. Like she was unpacking a bag she'd carried sealed shut for years and finally found someone willing to help her sort through what was inside. Selling herself at 16 because there wasn't another way to eat, because the streets had taught her quickly that hunger doesn't wait for better options to present themselves. The Vantine Concern finding her at 18 offering money and protection in exchange for work she didn't ask too many questions about until the work became running drugs. Then running people. Then she stopped there the first time, jaw tight, eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder, and I didn't push because some doors need to open from the inside or they don't open honestly at all. She told me the rest 2 visits later, unprompted again, like she'd decided I'd earned it, sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap the whole time as though stillness was the only way she could get the words out without coming apart around them. The men she'd been made to entertain when the syndicate needed leverage on a buyer. Men whose faces she said she'd trained herself to forget the moment they left the room because remembering would have made the next one impossible. The 2 jobs she'd been ordered to do that weren't about drugs or trafficking at all. Jobs that ended with men not getting up again. Jobs she still saw when she closed her eyes. Replayed in a loop she'd never found a way to switch off no matter how many years passed between then and now. "I'm not a good person," she said after, the words coming out steady even though her hands, I noticed, had started trembling slightly in her lap. "I want you to understand that before you decide I'm someone worth all this attention you're giving me. Before you build me into something better than what I actually am. You did things because you were trapped into doing them. That doesn't undo them. No. But it changes what they mean." She studied me like she was deciding whether to believe that or file it away as another kind word from someone who didn't have to live with the things she'd lived with, another well-meaning sentiment that would evaporate the moment it was tested against something real. "You really believe people can do terrible things and still be worth saving? I believe you were failed by everyone who should have stopped this before it started. Your father. The system. All of it. None of that's an excuse for what came after, but it's the reason, and the reason matters. It has to matter or none of this makes any sense at all. Most people don't bother separating the two. It's easier to file someone as simply bad and move on. I'm not most people." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that I counted it as a win. The first real crack I'd seen in weeks of careful, guarded conversation. "No," she said. "You're really not." That was the visit where I leaned in and kissed her for the first time. Not planned, not something I'd let myself imagine doing, even though I'd thought about her mouth more than I wanted to admit. More than I'd admitted to anyone, including myself, until that exact moment when the distance between us in that small visiting room suddenly felt impossible to maintain any longer. Her lips were soft and careful at first, like she expected me to pull back and laugh it off as a mistake. Like she'd built in the assumption of rejection so thoroughly that even my staying felt at first like something she had to verify rather than simply accept. When I didn't pull back, when I stayed, her hand came up to the side of my face like she was making sure I was real, fingers light against my jaw, testing the solidity of the moment the way you test ice before trusting your full weight to it. The kiss deepened, slow, unhurried, both of us learning the shape of something we'd been circling for weeks without naming it. Something that had been building in every drive along the river, every visit that ran longer than it needed to, every silence we'd let stretch instead of filling with the safer kind of small talk. When we broke apart, her forehead rested against mine, breath uneven. The guard's footsteps somewhere down the hall, the only sound in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had a minute before. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice catching slightly on the words. "I know. Do it again anyway." I did. 3 weeks before sentencing, I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie awake running the numbers. What a life sentence meant for someone who'd already lost almost every year that should have been hers. What it would mean for me to keep visiting a woman in a maximum security facility for the rest of both our lives. Knowing the version of justice that put her there was the same version that had let men like her father and men like the ones running the Vantine Concern operate untouched for years while everyone in a position to stop them looked the other way. For reasons that always sounded reasonable in the moment and monstrous in hindsight. I thought about my dad's signature on that buried report more than I wanted to, turning it over at 2 and 3 in the morning until the shape of it stopped surprising me and started just hurting, dull and constant, the way an old injury aches before a storm. I went to see him finally 3 weeks before her sentencing, sat across from him at the table where he'd taught me long division and how to field strip a service weapon. The same scarred wood surface that had held 2 decades of homework and holiday meals and now held something neither of us had a script for, and asked him directly about the inquiry. He didn't deny it. That was almost worse than if he had, because denial would have given me something to push against, and instead he just sat very still, his hands flat on the table, looking older than I'd ever let myself notice before. It was complicated, Maddie. There were people above me who wanted it closed, and I made a call that I'm not proud of, but I made it because the alternative looked like losing everything I'd built to protect this family, and I told myself the greater good. The greater good let a trafficking operation keep running for 11 more years. I know what it did. Do you? Because I've spent the last month talking to one of the people who lived inside what you let keep running. My voice came out steadier than I felt, the words landing in the small kitchen like stones dropped into still water, spreading out into a silence that filled the whole room. His face went pale in a way I'd never seen, not even the day he found out I'd applied to the academy against his initial wishes. Maddie. Her name is Ruby. She's 26. Her father started assaulting her when she was 9, and by the time she was old enough to run, there was nowhere to run to except exactly the kind of operation your report let keep operating. She's facing life in prison in 3 weeks, Dad. For things she did because the system you taught me to believe in failed her at every single turn, starting with the turn that should have stopped her father and never did. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have an answer, sitting there with his hands still flat on the table like he was bracing against something he couldn't name, and something in me that had been holding on to a version of him I needed to be true finally let go, quietly, without drama, the way a rope finally gives after fraying for years. I left without finishing the coffee he'd made, the mug still half full and cooling on the counter behind me. I didn't go back for 2 weeks, and when I did, it wasn't the same between us, and I don't think it ever fully will be again, not because I'd stopped loving him but because love and disappointment had learned to occupy the same space in a way I hadn't known they could. That night, I went to the precinct after hours, the building emptied out to the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional radio chatter from the night shift, and pulled every file related to Ruby's transport schedule, sentencing logistics, the security detail assigned to her for the final week before her court date. I told myself I was just looking. I kept looking until 2 in the morning, coffee gone cold beside me, until the shape of something impossible started looking less impossible the longer I stared at it, until impossible started shading hour by hour into merely difficult. A transfer order, properly forged, could reroute her transport. A 5-minute gap existed between 2 camera systems during a scheduled maintenance window I knew about because I'd filed the maintenance request myself months ago for an unrelated reason that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder later whether some part of you had been planning this longer than you'd admitted. And there was one person who owed me a debt large enough to make the rest possible. A desk sergeant I'd covered for 2 years back. The kind of favor that goes unspoken until the day it's called in, sitting quiet between 2 people who both understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it would cost. I sat with the file open in front of me, my badge sitting beside the cold coffee, and understood that I had already made the decision. I'd made it the day I pulled the car to the shoulder and she told me about the doors that wouldn't lock. Everything since had just been catching up to that fact, every visit, every drive, every kiss in a small room with a guard's footsteps echoing down the hall, all of it converging toward this one impossible necessary thing. I called the desk sergeant the next morning. His name was Justin Cameron and he'd been on the force 11 years, the kind of steady presence who showed up early and never complained, the sort of officer who got passed over for commendations because doing the job well without making noise about it doesn't photograph well for department newsletters. 2 years back I'd covered a mistake of his that would have ended his career. A misfiled evidence chain that wasn't his fault exactly but would have looked like it was, if anyone but me had been the one to find it first. I'd fixed it quietly, spent a weekend untangling a paperwork knot that wasn't mine to untangle and never mentioned it again. He'd never forgotten. I need a transfer order, I told him in the parking garage where the cameras didn't reach, my voice lower than it needed to be even in that emptiness, rerouted through the east corridor during the Thursday maintenance window. He didn't ask why, which told me he already suspected or didn't want to know badly enough to ask, his eyes moving once toward the garage entrance like he was checking we were really alone. That's the corridor with the camera gap. I know. You understand what you're asking me to help with. I do. He went quiet, studying me like he was trying to find the version of me he'd known for 2 years inside whatever I'd become in the last 6 weeks, searching my face for the careful, by-the-book officer who'd once spent a weekend saving his career and finding instead someone he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. She got to you, he said finally. Not a question. Yes. Worth it? I don't know yet. But I know what happens if I don't try. You understand they'll come for me too once they figure out the order was forged from the inside. I've thought about that. I wouldn't ask if I had any other way through this. He looked at me a long moment more, then exhaled, slow, the sound of a decision settling into place. I've got a sister, he said. Got hurt by men like the ones you're describing back before I ever put on a badge. Took her years to put herself back together. I never forgot what that cost her, or what it would have cost if nobody'd ever gotten her out. He shook his head once like he was arguing with himself and losing. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I know what happens to girls like her when nobody's willing to take a risk. Either way, thank you. He helped me build the order over 3 days, careful, layered, designed to survive a glance but fall apart under real scrutiny, which meant we needed it to work fast and not be questioned until well after it mattered. Every signature and routing code checked twice against templates Cameron pulled from systems I didn't ask too many questions about. He pulled the maintenance schedule and confirmed the window. 5 minutes between camera systems on the East Corridor, the Thursday before her Friday sentencing, a gap so narrow it left almost no room for anything to go even slightly wrong. I didn't tell Ruby what I was planning. I couldn't risk it showing on her face during a routine visit, couldn't risk Hope changing how she carried herself in a building full of people trained to notice exactly that kind of shift, guards who'd spent careers learning to read the difference between resignation and anticipation in the posture of the people they watched. I saw her the day before, official visit, nothing on paper to suggest it was different from any other, though everything in me felt different walking through that door knowing what the next 24 hours would hold. You're quiet today, she said, studying me across the small table the way she always did, like she was reading something in my face I hadn't decided to show yet. Thinking. About. Tomorrow. She studied me, and for a second I thought she'd guessed, but she just nodded, slow, like she'd resigned herself to walking into the courthouse on Friday no matter what tomorrow held, like hope had become a luxury she'd stopped allowing herself even in small doses. Whatever happens, she said, I want you to know that the last few weeks are the only time in my life I felt like someone actually saw me. Not what I did. Me. I do see you. I know. That's the thing I didn't expect to happen. I kissed her then, slower than the first time, both of us aware of the glass and the guard outside even as we leaned into it, her hand finding the back of my neck, mine cupping her jaw the way she'd cupped mine that first time, like I needed to hold something steady while everything else shook loose. When we pulled back, she pressed her forehead to mine again, the gesture that had become hers, ours, in the weeks since, a small ritual neither of us had named but both of us had come to depend on. Tomorrow, I said, trust me. Whatever happens, trust me. I already do. That's the problem. I left without telling her more, carrying the weight of a plan I couldn't share, hoping it would be enough that I'd built it carefully, hoping the 5 minutes I'd bought us would stretch far enough to carry both our lives somewhere neither of us had ever been allowed to imagine. Thursday came gray and overcast, the kind of sky that made the whole city look like it was holding its breath. The transfer order routed Ruby's transport through the East Corridor at 11:40, ostensibly for a security reassessment ahead of sentencing. Cameron confirmed the maintenance window held. 2 cameras down, 5 minutes, no second chances, no margin for anything going even slightly sideways. I was the assigned escort. That part hadn't needed forging. My name had been on her transport rotation for weeks, and nobody questioned it now. The routine of it so established that not even the most careful supervisor would have flagged it for a second look. The van pulled into the corridor at 11:38. I sat across from her, her hands cuffed in her lap, 2 other officers up front who had no idea what the next 4 minutes would require of all of us, chatting between themselves about something inconsequential while the city slid past the windows, oblivious to the fact that the world they understood was about to end for at least one of us in the back. Maddie. Her voice low, urgent, eyes finding mine across the narrow space between the bench seats. What's happening? Trust me. The van slowed at the corridor's midpoint, exactly where Cameron's schedule said it would, brakes easing without any obvious cause that would have alerted the officers up front. I'd palmed the second set of keys 2 days ago, copied off a master ring during a shift change when nobody was tracking who held what, the small metal weight of them sitting against my hip since the moment I'd lifted them, a constant reminder of how far past the point of return I'd already traveled. The side door released easier than I expected, almost too easy, like the world had decided to cooperate for once after years of making everything difficult. Out. Now. I had her wrist before the words finished leaving my mouth, cuffs already falling away. I'd uncuffed her the moment the door released, hands working faster than thought, muscle memory built from years of training redirected entirely against everything that training had been meant to serve. We dropped from the moving van onto the access road, rolled hard onto concrete that scraped through my jacket and bit into my palms, and I had her up and running before either of us had fully caught a breath, the impact still ringing through both our bodies. Behind us, I heard the van's brakes locking, shouting, a radio crackling to life too late to matter, voices rising in confusion before they could organize into pursuit. The camera gap held. The 5 minutes held. We were 3 blocks gone into the warren of side streets I'd mapped a dozen times in my head over the last week, every turn memorized until it lived in my legs instead of my mind, before any alarm worth raising had actually been raised. Maddie, what did you do? I broke the law. Badly. Permanently. Keep running. We didn't stop until we'd put 6 blocks and 2 turns between us and the corridor, ducked into a stairwell that smelled like rust and old rain. Both of us gasping, chests heaving, her staring at me like she was seeing something she didn't have a category for yet, something that didn't fit into any framework her life had given her for understanding what people did for each other. You can't take this back, she said between breaths, her back against the cold concrete wall. I know. They'll hunt you exactly the way they hunt me now. Worse maybe. You were one of them. I know that too. Why? I caught her face in both hands, her skin cold from the run, her eyes wide and searching in the dim stairwell light filtering down from a grated window somewhere above us. Because the version of justice I believed in my whole life let your father walk free and called what happened to you afterward a crime instead of a consequence. Because I looked at that and looked at you and I couldn't make the math come out any other way. I had to choose and I chose you. She kissed me before I finished processing my own words, hard and desperate, both of us shaking, the kind of kiss that carried fear and relief and disbelief all tangled together, her hands fisting in my jacket like she needed to hold on to proof that this was actually happening, that the last 4 minutes hadn't been some cruel dream her mind had constructed to soften what was coming. We had 40 minutes before the city locked down every exit point, the math of it running constantly in the back of my mind even through the kiss, even through the fear. I had a car stashed 2 blocks over, cash withdrawn in small increments over the past month so it wouldn't flag, 2 sets of clothes that weren't either of ours originally, bought from a thrift shop 3 towns over where nobody would remember my face. It wasn't much. It would have to be enough. Where do we go? She asked as we ran for the car, her hand locked tight in mine. Anywhere they're not looking yet. It wasn't a real answer. We both knew it. But it was the only one I had and she took my hand and ran with me anyway, and for the first time since I'd pulled her over a chain-link fence on the docks, neither of us was running from the same thing. We were running toward something instead, together into whatever came next, the city's sirens already starting to rise somewhere behind us as we pulled away. We spent the first week in a motel off a county road, paying cash, keeping the curtains shut, listening to a radio that talked about us in the careful language of manhunts. A disgraced officer, a fugitive courier, a reward climbing higher. Every day the search came up empty. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of place that asked no questions because asking questions was bad for business, and we moved through it carefully, like 2 people learning the shape of a life that hadn't existed a week before. Ruby watched the broadcasts with a stillness I was starting to recognize as her version of fear, the kind that didn't show on her face so much as in how quiet she went, how her hands stilled in her lap, how her breathing evened out into something too controlled to be natural. They'll use your father, she said the third night, not looking up from the window, the street light outside throwing thin bars of light across the floor through the gap in the curtains. The press. They'll dig into him, into you, make it a story about a good cop's daughter gone wrong. Let them. You say that like it doesn't matter. It matters. It just doesn't change anything I'd do differently. She turned from the window then, crossed the small room and sat beside me on the edge of the bed, close enough that her shoulder pressed against mine, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. I keep waiting for you to regret it, she said. Every morning I wake up and brace for the version of you that looks at me and sees what it cost. That version doesn't exist. You don't know that yet. We've been doing this for a week. I know what I felt the day you told me about the doors that wouldn't lock. I've felt it every day since. A week doesn't undo that. Neither will a year. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes moving over my face like she was looking for the lie in it and failing to find one, then reached up and traced the line of my jaw with her fingers, slow, like she was memorizing something she still didn't quite trust would stay. Nobody's ever chosen me first, she said. Not once. Not my father, not the people who were supposed to protect me, not the syndicate that only wanted what I could do for them. You're the first person who looked at the cost and chose me anyway. I'd choose you in every version of this. She kissed me then, slow and searching, none of the urgency of the stairwell, just two people finally allowed to take their time in a room that for one night belonged only to us. Her hands found the hem of my shirt, hesitant at first, asking a question her mouth didn't need to voice, and I answered by pulling her closer, letting the motel's thin walls and the radio's quiet warnings fade into something that didn't matter anymore. We undressed each other slowly, reverently, like the act itself was an apology for every hand that had ever touched her without asking, every moment she'd had to perform wanting instead of feeling it. I traced the line of her collarbone with my mouth, felt her breath catch and steady, felt the particular trust it took for her to let her eyes close instead of watching the door the way she told me she always had to. I kissed the scar along her jaw and the ones I found after, on her ribs, her hip, places she flinched at first and then slowly let me stay, her body relearning in real time that a hand on her skin didn't have to mean what it had always meant before. She touched me back with a kind of careful wonder, like she was relearning what her own hands were for outside the context of survival. Fingers tracing my spine, my shoulder, pausing at the places where she could feel my pulse jump under her palm as though she needed proof that I was as affected as she was. When she finally let herself want something openly, asking with her body instead of bracing for refusal, I gave her everything I knew how to give, slow and unhurried, listening to every catch of breath and small sound as though they were the only language that mattered in that room. She cried at one point, quiet, not from pain, and when I started to pull back she held me closer instead, whispering that it was the good kind, the kind she didn't have a name for because nobody had ever made her feel it before, not gentleness layered over want, not tenderness that asked nothing in return. After, she lay with her head on my chest, my fingers tracing slow patterns on her back. Both of us quiet in the dark, her breathing gradually slowing into something I hadn't yet heard from her, something close to peace. I used to think love was something that happened to other people, she said, her voice barely above a whisper against my skin. People with normal fathers and normal childhoods and normal lives that didn't teach them to flinch. It happened to you anyway. It happened to me anyway, she repeated, like she was testing whether saying it made it more true, turning the words over the way she turned over so many other hard things since I'd met her. I don't know how to be soft, Maddie. I've spent so long being hard that I don't know if there's anything left underneath. I've seen what's underneath. It's the best part of you. She didn't answer that, just pressed closer, her arm tightening around my waist, and we fell asleep tangled together in a motel room 200 miles from a city that wanted both our names on warrants, and for one night, none of it touched us. The checkpoint came 11 weeks in, on a stretch of interstate we hadn't meant to take but a closed bridge forced us onto. Routine traffic stop, the kind every state ran a dozen times a day, except our faces had been circulating long enough that even a tired highway patrolman might place them if he looked twice, The kind of recognition that comes slow and then all at once, the way it had probably come for 100 other fugitives across 100 other checkpoints over the decades. "Stay calm," I told Ruby as the line of cars crawled forward, brake lights stretching ahead of us into the dark. "Let me talk. You're the one whose face was on every news channel in this state 2 months ago. Which is exactly why I know how they're looking for me. Trust the process. The IDs Cameron had helped me source before the escape were good, not perfect, the kind that held up to a glance but not a real records check, printed on stock close enough to government issue to survive a flashlight but not a database query. We'd practiced names until they came out smooth. Daniela Marsh and Sarah Lane, a couple driving south for a funeral, a story boring enough that nobody would want to dig deeper, the kind of cover that worked precisely because it asked nothing of the listener's imagination. The officer who leaned into our window was young, the kind of young that came with either careful thoroughness or careless boredom, and for a long, terrible second I couldn't tell which I was looking at, his flashlight sweeping once across the back seat before settling on our faces. "Where you two headed?" "Funeral down in Castor County," I said, voice steady, the same voice I'd used 100 times running my own checkpoints before any of this had a name. "Her aunt." He glanced at Ruby and I felt her go very still beside me, the particular stillness of someone deciding whether running was still an option, calculating the distance to the shoulder, the speed of the cars stacked behind us, all the variables of a decision neither of us wanted to have to make. "Long drive for a funeral. Family's family." He held the look a beat too long, long enough that my hand found the door handle without my permission, calculating exits, distances, what we'd have to leave behind if this went wrong. The bag in the trunk, the cash sewn into the lining of my jacket, a life we'd barely started building. Then he handed the licenses back, told us to drive safe and waved us through, the whole exchange over in under 90 seconds that felt like an entire night compressed into a single breath. We didn't speak until we'd put 20 miles behind us, the checkpoint's lights shrinking to nothing in the rear view, and even then it was just Ruby exhaling, long and shaking, her hand finding mine across the console and gripping hard enough to leave marks. "That was close," she said. "Too close. We can't use those names again. We can't use this car again either. Not after that stop's logged." She was right, and we both knew what it meant. The safe house we'd been slowly building 2 states over, the contacts we'd started cultivating among people who'd also fallen out of the syndicate's good graces, all of it had to be approached now assuming our trail had a fresh thread someone could pull, every careful plan suddenly compromised by 90 seconds at a checkpoint we hadn't even meant to drive through. We abandoned the car 40 miles later in a long-term lot outside a regional airport, wiped it down for prints out of habit more than confidence it would matter, walked 2 miles to a bus station under a sky just starting to lighten, and started over with names we hadn't used yet. It was that night in a new motel with a new set of fake names and a feeling like the walls were thinner everywhere we went, the air still carrying the adrenaline of the checkpoint hours after the fact, that Ruby first mentioned the others. "There's people like us," she said, sitting cross-legged on the bed, the lamp throwing long shadows across a room that looked exactly like every other room we'd stayed in. "Former Vantine. People the syndicate chewed up and spat out, or people who saw too much and got out before it killed them. I know 2 of them. Maybe 3. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we can't keep running forever on luck and forged IDs. Eventually luck runs out. Tonight should have taught us that even if nothing else does. But if there were more of us, people who knew the syndicate's operations from the inside, people with nothing left to lose." "You're talking about fighting back." "I'm talking about not just surviving. I'm tired of surviving, Maddie. I want to live somewhere that isn't constant fear, and the only way I see that happening is if the thing hunting us stops being able to hunt anyone." Her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard before, something that had been building under the surface for weeks and had finally found its way to the air. I thought about my father's signature on a buried report, about 11 wasted years, about how many more rubies were still out there in gaps the system had built and refused to close, about a checkpoint that had nearly ended everything an hour ago over nothing more than bad luck and a closed bridge. Tell me about the others, I said. Their names were Soledad and Priya, and Ruby found them through a network of careful signals. A phrase dropped in the right forum, a meeting arranged in a parking lot at 2 in the morning under a streetlight that flickered just enough to keep the scene from feeling fully safe. Both of them as wary of us as we were of them, until Ruby said 3 words that apparently meant something inside the syndicate's old hierarchy, and the wariness cracked open into something like trust, slow and grudging, but real. Soledad had been an enforcer, the kind of role that meant she knew the syndicate's safe houses, its supply routes, its internal hierarchy better than almost anyone outside its inner circle, carrying herself with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of having to be ready for violence at any moment. She'd left after being ordered to do something to a 12-year-old runner who'd skimmed product and refused and barely survived the refusal, a decision that had cost her 2 ribs and most of her former life, but none of her conviction that she'd made the right call. Priya had been a financial courier, numbers and ledgers, the kind of quiet competence that meant she knew exactly where the Vantine Concern kept its money and how it moved. A woman who spoke rarely but precisely, every word weighed before it left her mouth. You want to build something, Soledad said, the first night we all sat together in a rented house at the edge of a town small enough that nobody asked questions. The 4 of us arranged around a table that had clearly hosted card games and family dinners before it ever hosted a conversation like this one. Not just hide. Build. I want them to stop being able to do what they did to her, I said, nodding at Ruby, and what they did to you and to whoever's still inside right now wondering if there's a way out. That's not hiding. That's a war. Then it's a war. Priya laughed, short and disbelieving, the sound cutting through the room's tension for just a second. You're a cop. I'm not anymore. I gave that up the day I pulled her out of a transport van. It took weeks to become something resembling a plan, late nights around that same table covered in maps and printouts and the particular debris of careful, dangerous planning. Priya's knowledge of the financial structure meant we could starve specific operations by exposing the holding companies that funded them, feeding information to journalists who'd take the story without asking where it came from, building a paper trail that would eventually become impossible for anyone to ignore. Soledad's knowledge of safe houses meant we could identify which ones held trafficked people who needed rescuing before any larger move, get them out, get them somewhere safe, before the syndicate even knew its own foundations were being pulled out from under it, one careful operation at a time. Ruby ran point on the people, the way only someone who'd lived it could, knowing how to approach a frightened person mid-operation without spooking them, knowing what words would land as rescue instead of another kind of threat, drawing on every instinct she'd built surviving inside the exact machinery we were now trying to dismantle. I ran the operational security. The part of me that had spent 2 years learning surveillance and counter-surveillance now turned entirely against the people I used to work beside. Every skill the Academy had given me repurposed toward an entirely different kind of justice. We found 2 more in the following month. A man named Desmond who'd driven for the syndicate and wanted out the moment he understood what some of his runs actually carried, quiet and steady, the sort of calm that made him good at logistics and better at keeping his nerve under pressure. A woman who went only by Ren, who'd been trafficked the same way Ruby once was and had escaped 2 years back, living since in a kind of careful invisibility that our cause finally gave a purpose, her medical training from some life before all this proving more valuable than any of us could have guessed at the time. 5 of us, then 6, in a house that smelled of old paper and the particular tension of people who'd all decided that being hunted while doing something mattered more than being hunted while hiding, every one of us carrying our own version of what had brought us to that table. You understand what happens if this fails, Ruby said to me one night, both of us lying awake long after the others had gone to sleep. The house quiet around us except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. I understand. Some of us won't make it through this. Maybe all of us. I know. Are you scared? I turned to face her in the dark, found her eyes already on mine like she'd been watching me think it through. Terrified, I said. But I'm more scared of what happens if we don't try. I've spent my whole life believing the system would eventually do the right thing if we were just patient enough. I don't believe that anymore. I believe in this instead. In us. She kissed me, soft and certain, and we held each other through a night that felt, for the first time in months, less like running and more like preparing. The first real operation hit a safe house on the city's eastern edge. The one Soledad remembered held 3 trafficked women being moved through to a buyer overseas within the week. We planned it for 11 days, mapped the guard rotation from Soledad's memory and Priya's intercepted communications, built a timeline with margins thin enough to terrify me and tight enough to actually work, rehearsing every contingency until the plan lived in muscle memory instead of just on paper. It worked. 3 women out, moved through a network Ren had quietly built over her 2 years of invisibility, connections to shelters and lawyers who asked the right kind of no questions, the whole extraction running clean from entry to exit in under 11 minutes. No casualties, no alarms raised until well after we'd cleared the area, a success that felt almost unreal in the adrenaline-soaked hour after it happened. Ruby cried after, in the car, relief and rage tangled together the way I'd come to recognize is just how she felt most things now. Never simply, always at least 2 emotions deep, grief riding alongside triumph until every victory felt costly even when nothing visible had been lost. That's 3, she said, her voice rough with feeling. 3 people who don't go where I almost went. That's 3. There's more. We did 4 more operations over the following 2 months, each one bleeding information back to journalists Priya had carefully cultivated, each leak chipping at the holding companies that gave the Vantine Concern its legal cover. The syndicate noticed. Of course they noticed. By the 5th operation the guard rotations had changed, the security had tightened, and the margins I'd built started shrinking in ways that made my chest tight every time we walked into a building we didn't fully control. Every plan now requiring twice the contingencies it had needed in those early, almost careless weeks. The 6th operation was the one that went wrong. We'd targeted a processing site further inland, bigger than anything we'd hit before, holding records that would have exposed half the Vantine Concern's remaining financial network if Priya could get them out clean. Soledad's information was a week old by the time we moved. A week was usually fine, but the syndicate had shifted its security model faster than our intelligence could track, and we walked into a building with twice the guards we'd planned for, the kind of discrepancy that only becomes visible the moment it's already too late to retreat cleanly. Desmond saw it first, the extra vehicles in the lot, and called the abort over the radio half a second before the first shot came from a position none of us had mapped, the sound of it cracking through the night air and shattering whatever margin of safety we'd thought we had. It became chaos in the way training never quite prepares you for, no matter how many drills, no matter how many times you'd run scenarios in a controlled room with people who weren't actually trying to kill you. I got Priya out through the east exit, the records secured in the bag she'd refused to let go of even as we ran, her hands white-knuckled around the strap the entire sprint across open ground. Ruby and Soledad were supposed to be 30 seconds behind us. They weren't. I heard Soledad's voice over the radio first, tight and clipped, reporting she was hit, reporting Ruby was pulling her, reporting the west exit was compromised and they were rerouting, her voice fighting to stay steady through what I could already hear was real pain. Then static. Then nothing, a silence that stretched on long enough to feel like its own kind of verdict. I made Priya keep running, made her promise to get the records to the rendezvous point no matter what happened behind her, and went back, every instinct from 2 years of police training screaming that going back into an active scene without backup was exactly the mistake that got people killed, every instinct from the months since screaming louder that I wasn't leaving either of them behind. I found Ruby 3 minutes later in an access corridor, Soledad's weight braced against her shoulder, both of them moving slower than the gunfire behind them allowed for, Ruby's face white with effort and fear in equal measure. Soledad had taken a shot to the side, low, the kind of wound that needed a hospital we couldn't risk and time we didn't have, blood already soaking through her shirt in a dark, spreading stain. We got them both out. Desmond had the van running, Ren covering the exit with a clarity under pressure that surprised all of us, calling angles and timing like she'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. And we cleared the lot as a second wave of vehicles arrived, too late to stop us but close enough that I felt the proximity of how badly it could have gone for days after. The memory of those headlights in the rear view returning every time I closed my eyes. Soledad didn't survive the night. Ren, who'd trained as a medic in another life she rarely talked about, did everything possible in the back of that van and in the farmhouse we'd retreated to, hands steady even as her voice grew quieter with every passing hour, and it still wasn't enough. She died a little after 3 in the morning, with Ruby holding one hand and Priya holding the other. The records she'd helped us get safely tucked into a bag 6 feet away, paid for with a cost none of us were ready to call worth it, even though we all understood in the silence after, that the records would still save people, even as Soledad couldn't be one of the people saved. Ruby didn't speak for 2 days after, moving through those days like someone carrying something too heavy to set down even for a moment. I didn't push. I just stayed close, the way she taught me to without either of us ever naming it as a lesson, and waited for whatever came next. We buried Soledad in a clearing behind the farmhouse. No headstone, nothing that could be traced, just a circle of people who understood exactly what she'd given and exactly how little the world outside that circle would ever know to mourn her. The ground was hard to dig that time of year, and we took turns with the single shovel we had, nobody speaking much, the work itself becoming its own kind of tribute. Ruby spoke when it came to it, 3 sentences about a woman who'd refused to hurt a child even when refusing nearly cost her everything, and that refusal had ended up costing her everything anyway just later on different terms, her voice steady through all 3 sentences and breaking only after, once the words were done and there was nothing left to hold it together. The records Priya extracted detonated through 3 news cycles inside a week. Federal agencies that had been slow-walking the Vantine Concern investigation for years suddenly had no excuse left to slow-walk it further, not with documentation this explicit, landing in front of reporters who knew exactly how to make sure it couldn't be quietly buried the way other inquiries had been buried before. Rest followed. Seizures. The kind of structural damage that doesn't make a syndicate disappear but makes it bleed out slowly, unable to fully recover. Every new headline another piece of the machine that had built Ruby's old life coming apart in public. It should have felt like winning. It mostly felt like grief with a press conference attached, the kind of victory that arrives wearing black. We did what we set out to do, Priya said the night the 3rd wave of arrests hit the news, the 4 of us watching the same screen in a silence that had nothing celebratory in it. The concern's never going to be what it was. Soledad's still gone, Ruby said. I know. I keep thinking about the 12-year-old she wouldn't hurt. I never even knew her name. Soledad never told us. I think she wanted to keep that part just for herself. Ruby's voice had gone soft and the words landed harder for it, not less. We sat with that for a long while, the television playing footage of federal agents leading Vantine executives out of buildings in handcuffs. Footage that should have felt like vindication and instead felt like watching a door close on a chapter that had cost more than any of us had been ready to pay, even knowing going in exactly what we were risking. But the syndicate's collapse didn't mean our names came off any list. If anything, it made us more valuable as targets. Loose ends in a story federal prosecutors wanted neatly closed. Witnesses whose testimony could either complete the case against the concern's remaining leadership or complicate it beyond repair depending on which side got to us first. The government wanted us found exactly as badly as the syndicate's remnants did, just for different reasons and with cleaner paperwork. A distinction that mattered to nobody but the people drawing up the warrants. Desmond left the group 2 weeks after Soledad's death, not from any falling out, just an exhaustion that none of us could blame him for, taking a new name and a new direction and a promise to never make contact again, for everyone's safety including his own, the kind of parting that felt less like abandonment and more like one more cost paid by a war that kept extracting them in different currencies. Ren stayed, quieter than before, carrying the weight of having tried and failed to save someone the way nobody had managed to save her years ago, the failure settling into her like a stone she'd carry without ever fully setting down. Priya, Ruby and I kept moving. Different states, different names, the rhythm of running that had become its own kind of life. Except now it carried the particular grief of knowing exactly what the running had cost and exactly who wasn't running anymore because of choices we'd made together. Soledad's absence of fourth presence in every room we passed through after. "Do you regret it?" Ruby asked me one night, both of us lying in the dark of yet another temporary room, the ceiling fan above us turning slow and creaking on every third rotation. "Any of it. Breaking me out, the operations, Soledad. I regret that Soledad died. I'll regret that every day for the rest of my life. But the rest of it?" I found her hand in the dark, held it the way I had on that first drive along the river, when she told me about doors that wouldn't lock. The gesture grown so familiar between us now it barely needed conscious thought. "The rest of it I'd do again," I said. "Every time. Because the alternative was you in a cell for the rest of your life for crimes that were never fully yours to begin with, and a syndicate that would have kept finding girls like you for as long as nobody stopped it. We stopped some of it. That has to count for something even with what it cost." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I love you. I don't think I've said that plainly before." "You haven't. I love you too. I think I have every day, just not always with the words." She kissed me, slow and grateful and sad all at once, and we held each other through another night in another room in another city we'd leave behind within weeks, carrying Soledad's absence and each other's presence in equal, inseparable measure. A year out from the harbor docks where I'd first cuffed her, we're still moving. Still using names that aren't ours, still watching exits in every room we enter, still feeling the particular exhaustion of a life built entirely around not being found by either side of a war we started. A vigilance that's become so automatic it no longer even registers as effort most days. The Vantine Concern is a fraction of what it was. Federal prosecutions continue, slow but grinding forward, fed by records Priya secured and testimony from people Ren and Soledad helped pull free before the cost became what it became. Somewhere out there, women who would have been trafficked overseas are instead living lives nobody interrupted, names I'll never know attached to futures that exist now only because a handful of us decided the risk was worth taking, and I hold on to that on the nights the rest of it gets heavy, when the weight of everything we've lost threatens to outweigh everything we've saved. My father and I talk sometimes, careful calls through channels I won't describe even here, because some habits from my old life are worth keeping. He's retired now, spends his time, he tells me, trying to make amends in ways that don't undo anything but might eventually mean something, volunteering with organizations he never would have noticed before all this. I don't know if I've forgiven him. I know I understand him better than I did. The weight of choices made under pressure by people who aren't as brave as they want to believe they are, and some days that has to be enough. The government hasn't stopped looking for us. I don't expect they ever fully will. A fugitive officer and a former syndicate courier who helped break a trafficking network from the outside make an uncomfortable story for institutions that prefer their narratives clean, and clean isn't something Ruby and I have ever been able to offer them. We're complicated. We're inconvenient. We're alive and together, and that counts as a victory all its own even when it doesn't feel like one, even on the days when the running wears thinner than usual. Priya's still with us, quieter these days, carrying Soledad the way all of us do. Not as a wound exactly, more as a weight we've learned to carry without it crushing us entirely. The grief settled into something almost gentle with time, the way old aches settle into bones. Ren checks in when she can, building something steadier for herself in a city none of us will name, even to each other in case the wrong room is listening. Her voice on those calls a little lighter every time, like she's slowly finding her way back to a version of herself that existed before any of this. Ruby sleeps better now. Not perfectly. The doors in her dreams still don't always lock. But better, often enough that the nights she wakes gasping have become the exception instead of the rule. I'm there for those nights, the way I've been there since the first time she told me about them in a car neither of us should have stopped on the side of the road. And I've learned exactly what she needs in those moments. Sometimes words, sometimes just the weight of my arm across her shoulders until her breathing finds its way back to steady. Do you ever wonder what would have happened? she asked me last week in whatever city we're currently calling temporary home, her head resting against my shoulder as we watched the evening settle over a skyline neither of us had seen before this year. If you just booked me that first night and let the system run its course? I think about it. Then I think about Soledad's 12-year-old and the women Ren got out and you sleeping better than you have in years, and I know I'd choose this every time. Even with everything it cost? Even with everything it cost. The alternative wasn't safety, Ruby. It was just a different, slower way of losing you. She took my hand the way she had so many times now that the gesture barely needed the words around it anymore, and we sat together watching a city that didn't know our real names hunted, hers and mine, by a government that wanted us found and a syndicate too broken now to do much more than want. Later that night, in another unfamiliar room that had somehow already started to feel like ours simply because we were in it together, she kissed me slow and unhurried, the way she always did now, no urgency left in it, just certainty, the particular calm of two people who'd already survived the worst version of losing each other and chosen, every single day since, to stay. We're not safe. We may never be safe again, not in the way people mean when they use that word casually, assuming it as a baseline instead of recognizing it as the privilege it actually is. But we're together. We're free in the ways that matter most, even cornered in all the ways that don't. And some nights, when the doors in her dreams finally stay shut and she sleeps quiet against my shoulder, I let myself believe that's enough. Not the ending I would have chosen if anyone had ever offered me the choice, but the one we built ourselves, out of everything that tried to stop us and didn't.